We continue now at the top of Daf Yud Beis in Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 18b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara is discussing a case where a person finds a get, and let's say the name in the get is Yosef ben Shimon, for example. So when do we have to be concerned that maybe the get belongs to another individual who has the same name? And the Gemara said in the previous Amud, you have to say there are two conditions when we have such a concern. Number one, it has to be a place where the shayaros are mitzios, the caravans are frequent, there's a lot of people in that area. And number two, there has to be a chazaka that there are two Yosef ben Shimons in that city. If you have such a chazaka, so then already we have that concern. And the Gemara said you have to say that we have both of these conditions, because if you don't say that, you're going to have a contradiction within Rabba. And the Gemara brought a story. The story involved Rav Huna. Again, a get came before Rav Huna, similar kind of case. And Rav Huna said, Chayshinan l'shnei shvirei. Rav Huna said that we have to be concerned there are two cities named Shvirei. The location that was written in the get was Shvirei. And Rashi explains, Chayshinan l'shnei shvirei. He said, again, we have to be concerned of two cities named Shvirei. Afal pi sheba echad l'faneinu. The point over here is as follows. Even though one person comes before us, V'yamar mi meni nafal, and he says the get fell from me. Uploni haya mishalcho leishto, and so was sending it to his wife. V'yodananu she'ein sham b'shvirei shnei anashim shesh mosei and shavin, and we know that there are not in Shvirei two people with the same name. So really, we have reason to believe that it really fell from this particular shliach for this particular husband. But nevertheless, said Rav Huna, chayshinan sham b'shvirei acheres yesh. We're concerned maybe there's another city named Shvirei. V'yesh ba Yosef ben Shimon acher. Maybe in that city there's another person named Yosef ben Shimon. And the Gemara continues, V'yomer le Rav Chisda l'Rabba. So Rav Chisda said to Rabba, again, they heard this case that came before Rav Huna, and Rav Chisda said to Rabba, Poke ayin ba, go and investigate this case to la'ursa, boi minach Rav Huna, because in the evening, Rav Huna is going to ask you about this case. So nafak dok v'yeshkach. So he went out and he investigated and he found as follows. The Tanan, because we learned in the Mishnah, kol ma'isa bezin hareza yachzer. It says that anytime you have a ma'isa bezin, again, this is a document of bezin, so then you're supposed to return it to the owner. And so the Gemara now says, now when it comes to the bezin of Rav Huna, that is a place that is similar to a place where the caravans are frequent, there's a lot of people there. The kapashet Rabba de Yachzer, and what's Rabba saying? Rabba is essentially bringing this mission of Kal Maisa Bezin Hareze Yachzer to say that you should return the get. You don't have to be concerned that there's another Yosef ben Shimon, that there's another person with the same name. And so therefore, why are we not concerned? Rabba generally says that we are concerned with such a thing. So therefore, the Gemara says, Alma, we see from this that there's two conditions that we need to be concerned. It's not enough just to have Shayaros Metzios, but Alma, we see Ihuchzaku Shnei Yosef ben Shimon in. If there's a chazaka that there's two Yosef ben Shimons, only then, yes, do we have such a concern, lo, but if not, then we don't have such a concern, and that's why Rabba said we did not have a concern in this case of Rav Huna. And Rashi explains, V'yamar le Rav Chisda l'Rabba Garsin, and again, Rav Chisda said to Rabba, that's the proper text. Rav Chisda said to Rabba, investigate this case, because Rav Huna will ask you about it in the evening. And then he brought a proof from the Mishnah, which said, Kol Maisa Bezin Hareza Yachzer, any Maisa Bezin has to be returned, meaning Kol Milsa de Asal Bezin L'Kayim, anything that's come to Bezin for certification, to Lekal Mechash L'Nimlach Alein Shalo Litnon, at that point in time, we don't have to be concerned that the person decided not to give it. So Hareza Yachzer, so it has to be returned. V'zem Mekoyim Bezin Hayu L'Kach Uvasham, and this was certified in Bezin, and that's why it was brought there. And in any case, the point is, from saying Hareza Yachzer, he was saying that in this case as well, by the get as well, it should be returned. And the question is, why is there not a concern of two Yosef ben Shimons? And again, the answer is there's no concern, even though it's like a place of Shayaros Mitzuyas, because there were a lot of people in the Bezin of Rav Huna, but still, as long as there was no chazak of Shnei Yosef ben Shimon, there is no need to be concerned, according to Rabba. And the Gemara continues, Avad Rabba uvda beikisna de Pumbedisa kashmaite. Rabba ruled in accordance with his point of view at the flax house of Pumbedisa, meaning he ruled that he was not concerned that there was another Yosef ben Shimon. And the Gemara has two versions of understanding the story. Ika diamri, there are those that say, Heichad de mezavni kisna, we're talking about an area where they sold the flax, v'hu shelo huchzaku, and we're talking in a situation where there was no presumption of two people with the same name. Afagav de shchich and shayras, and the point is, even though it was frequent to have caravans there were a lot of people there, still he was not concerned because it was not huchzaku Shnei Yosef ben Shimon. V'ika diamri, there are those that say, Heichad de taru kisna, was the area where they soaked the flax, v'afagav de huchzaku, and even though it was a case where there was a chazaka, that there were two people with the same name, but the lo shchichi shayaros, but it was not common to have caravans, it wasn't frequent to have caravans, and that's why, again, he was not concerned, because you need both conditions in order to have such a concern. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Zera, Rami Masnis, and Abraisa. Rabbi Zera had a contradiction between the Mishnah Meseches Gittin and the Braisa, Umeshani, and he answered up the contradiction. Now, this is in contrast to Rab on the previous Amud. Again, Rab on the previous Amud had a contradiction between our Mishnah and the Mishnah in Gittin that we're about to quote. The point over here is that Rabbi Zera had the contradiction between the Mishnah in Meseches Gittin and the Braisa. And the Gemara continues, Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah Meseches Gittin, Hamevi get ve'avad heimenu, if somebody is bringing a get, he's delivering a get, and it's lost from him, Motzu la'alter, if it's found immediately, so kosher, then it's kosher. But if not, puzzle, it's going to be puzzle, it's disqualified. Again, you have to be concerned, maybe the get really belonged to somebody else with the same name. Uramini, we have the following contradiction from a Braisa, Motza get isha b'shuk, if somebody finds a get isha in the marketplace, a divorce document in the marketplace, Bizman shahabal mod, in a situation where the husband admits, yachzer l'isha, then you do return it to the wife. Ein habal mod, but if the husband does not admit, lo yachzer, lo lozeh, lo lozeh, then you don't return it to either party. So katzani mihas. Nevertheless, what does it say in this brayso? Bizman shabal moda. It says that if the husband admits yachzir leisha, then you return it to the wife. V'afilu lizman maruba. It sounds like it's saying you return it to the wife, even if it's been a long time. That's the contradiction, because again, the Mishnah Meseches Gittin says only la'alter you can use such a get, because if it's after a zman maruba, according to the Mishnah Meseches Gittin, we have a concern it really belongs to somebody else with the same name. Here in the brayso, it sounds like even lizman maruba, we don't have such a concern. So that's how Rabbi Zera set up the contradiction. Umeshani, and then Rabbi Zera answered, Kan b'makom shashayaros mitzuyos, v'chan b'makom shein hashayaros mitzuyos. In one case, we're talking about where there's frequent caravans. In such a case, we are concerned that it belongs to somebody else with the same name because there's a lot of people over there. And in the other case, we're talking about a situation where there's not a lot of caravans, not a lot of people, and therefore there is no such concern. And the Gemara says, Ika diamri, there are those that say, V'husha huchzaku delo nahader, that when Rabbi Zera says that if there's shayaros mitzuyos, you don't return it because there's a concern, that also assumes that it's huchzaku shnei Yosef ben Shimon birachas, that there's a chazaka, that there's somebody else with the same name, that's when you don't return it. You have to have both conditions. V'hainu derabba, and according to that version, Rabbi Zera essentially would be giving the same answer as Rabbah. Ika diamri, there are those that say that Rabbi Zera doesn't agree with Rabbah's answer, it's slightly different. Afagav delo huchzaku, even though you don't have a chazaka that there's two people with the same name, still lo nahader, still you don't return it because of the fact that the caravans are frequent. Upliga derabba, and according to that version, Rabbi Zera would argue with Rabbah. He would not say the exact same thing as Rabbah, because again, Rabbah is only concerned when you have both conditions, and according to this version of Rabbi Zera is even concerned with it when there's just one condition, that the shayaros are mitzuyos. And the Gemara continues, Bishlama Rabba lo amar ke Rabbi Zera. Now I understand why Rabba did not say like Rabbi Zera, meaning I understand why Rabba preferred to have a contradiction between two Mishnayos as opposed to a Mishnah and a Braisa, because Masnisan alim olei lakshuya, it's stronger for him to ask a question of a contradiction between Mishnayos. El Rabbi Zera, but Rabbi Zera, my time will amar ke Rabba. Why didn't he say like Rabba? Why is Rabbi Zera asking a question from the Mishnah Meseches Gittin on a Braisa when he could be asking from the Mishnah Meseches Gittin on our Mishnah? It's also the same contradiction. Again, because the Mishnah Meseches Gittin implies that after Zman Meruba we have a concern. Our Mishnah doesn't seem to say that. And the Gemara says to that, Amar Loch, he says to you, meaning Rabbi Zera will say to you, Mi katani ho amar tenu nosnin v'afil Zman Meruba. Does it say in our Mishnah that if the person says to give it, we give it even if it's been after a long time? It doesn't necessarily say anything about Zman Meruba. Dilma ha amar tenu nosnin. Maybe it means that if he says give it, we give it. Uliolam kedekayim alon lialter. And really it just means to say that you give it if it's immediate, but if it would be after a long time, maybe according to our Mishnah there would be a concern. That's why he didn't want to ask a contradiction from the Mishnah. And Rashi explains, Uliolam kedekaimalam kishanim salalter. It could be when we're talking about the inference from the Mishnah, it's only talking about returning the get if it's found immediately, v'im lav, and if not, puzzle, then it will be disqualified. Shema eno shalzeh. Maybe it doesn't belong to this person. Again, maybe it's somebody else with the same name. And Rashi points out, Avol Braisa, but when it comes to the Braisa, leka l'shanuye hachi, you can't answer in this way. You can't say that the Braisa, even though it doesn't mention anything, maybe the Braisa only means lialter. That can't be why. The kevon detana behedya yachzer l'isha, because since the Braisa says explicitly to return it to the wife, havalei lefluge ben lialter ben lizman meruba, so it should have made that distinction between immediate and after a long time. If there is such a distinction, the Braisa should have made the distinction, and by not making the distinction, it sounds like the Braisa does not hold of the distinction. And that's not comparable to the Mishnah, to hasam lo yachzer tana, because in the case of the Mishnah, it doesn't say anything about returning. It gives a case where you don't return it. Umiduk yahav a dayak yachzer yachzer, and then we make an inference and we say that there is a case where you do return it, heicha damar tanu, where the other party says to give it. V'keven delo tani yachzer lo havale lefluge, and since it doesn't actually say the word yachzer in the Mishnah doesn't actually have a case of yachzer, so there's no reason to have to make a distinction over there between la'alter and lizman meruba. Could be the Mishnah does hold of the distinction, even though it does not state that distinction outright. And the Gemara continues, Laman Damar Rabbi Zeira b'makam shashayaros Metziah, according to the version that said within Rabbi Zeira that in a situation where the caravans are frequent, there is a concern that maybe this get really belongs to somebody else with the same name. Even though there's no chazaka that there's another person with the same name, another person named Yosef ben Shimon, for example. Upliga de Rabba, and Rabbi Zeira in that way argues with Rabba, because Rabba says you have to have two conditions to have such a concern. Rabbi Zeira says just one condition of shayaros Metziah is enough. So the Gemara says, so if you're going to say that version of Rabbi Zeira and Rabba are arguing, what exactly are they arguing about? And the Gemara explains, Rabba holds, to Katani kol ma'isa bezin harei ze yachzer. As we said above, the Mishnah says that anytime you have a document of bezin, it has to be returned. So the ishtakach bebezin askinon. So he understands that we're talking about a document that's actually found in bezin. Ubezin kamokam shashayaros Metzuyos. And bezin is a place where the caravans are frequent, and apparently there is no such concern. We're still returning it. V'hu shehuchzaku lo yachzer. And so that's what we're saying. If there's a chazaka that there's another person with the same name, then you don't return it. But lo huchzaku yachzer, but as long as there's no chazaka, you do return it. And that's why the Mishnah says, Kol ma'isa bezin harei ze yachzer. That's how Rabba understands. For Rabbi Zeira amar lach, now Rabbi Zeira will say to you, how does he understand that Mishnah? Mi katani kol ma'isa bezin shenimsu bebezin. Does it say that you have a document of bezin that's found in bezin? It doesn't say it was found in bezin. What it means is, Kol ma'isa bezin yachzer katani. It just says any ma'isa bezin has to be returned. Well, liolam deshtaka chavroi, and really you could say that it was found outside of the bezin. That's why you're returning it. There's no concern because it's an area where the caravans are not frequent, but if it was an area where the caravans are frequent, there would be a concern according to Rabbi Zeira. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Yirmiyah says, another answer to the contradiction, Kagon de Ka'amri Eidim Me'olam Lo Chasamnu, Elo Al Get Echad Shel Yosef ben Shimon. When do we say that we return the document and we're not concerned that maybe it belongs to somebody else with the same name? That's only in a situation where the Eidim say we only signed one document, one get of Yosef ben Shimon. And the Gemara says, if so, my lememra, what do you even need to say that for? It's so obvious you return it in that case. Obviously, it doesn't belong to another person named Yosef ben Shimon if the Eidim say they only signed one such document. And the Gemara says it still is a chiddush because Mao Detema, what might you have said? Leichosh dilma isrmi shma keshma ve'edim ke'edim. We should be concerned. Maybe it happens to be not only the person with the same name, but also the Eidim have the same name. Maybe we should have such a concern. Kamash Malon, that's what it's teaching us, that in such a situation, once the Eidim say we only signed on one document, so then we are not concerned. And Rashi explains, Rabbi Yirmiyah says, Hadakatani Yachzer, when it says that you return the document, when it says we're not concerned that it belonged to somebody else with the same name, could go into Amri Eidim HaChasumin Bo Me'olam Lo Chasamnu V'chulu, that specifically when the Eidim who signed it say, we only signed one such document. And the Gemara continues with another answer to the contradiction. Ravashi says, Kegon deko amar nekev yesh bo b'tzaros plonis. When do we return the document that we know belonged to this particular person? We don't think it's another person with the same name. That's if the person says that there was a hole by the side of this particular letter, then it's clear that he knows the document, it's his document. And the Gemara says, V'davka b'tzaros plonis, but it's only in a situation where he says that it was at the side of this letter. Avol nekev bi'al malo, but if he just says in general there was a hole, that's not enough. And the Gemara explains, Ravashi Mesafkale, Ravashi is in doubt, Simonim Ido Raisa, Ido Rabbanon, whether Simonim, whether providing these kinds of signs, is that something that's valid on a Do Raisa level, or is it only on a Do Rabbanon level? And Rashi explains, Vidavka Bitzados Plonis, it's specifically if he says the hole is at the side of this particular letter, to have a Simon Muvak, that's considered a Simon Muvak, that's a clear Simon. Even if you say, by returning a lost object with Simonim, Di Boilon Lekamondo Raiso De Rabbanon, where we have a question later on whether that concept is dorais or derabanan. Afilo pashata simon derabanan. Even if you answer that simonim are derabanan, yesh lismach al simon muvak, because you certainly can rely on a simon muvak like this, lemishrei eishasish doraisa, to permit an eishasish, which is an issue that's a doraisa issue. And the Gemara explained Mesaf Kalei Ravashi simonim shemachzirin ben aveda. Ravashi had a suffix when it came to the idea of returning a lost object with simonim. Ido raisi va'afilo bisr doraisa samchinan asimin kaldu. Is that a concept midoraisa, and then even by an isr doraisa Doraisa, we would rely on any kind of siman. Either Rabbanan, or maybe that concept is only the Rabbanan, V'dafka ba'avedim, maybe we only rely on it by lost objects. Shehefker, Bezin, Hefker, there we can employ the idea of Hefker, Bezin, Hefker. Bezin has the ability to render something ownerless. They have the ability by monetary situations to transfer ownership. But then it could be that something at Doraisa level, we wouldn't rely necessarily on Simonim. Again, that's why you need a Simon Muvak over here. Vikash, and if you're going to ask, Nema Hachi Kasavar Simonim de Rabbanan, Vinifshad Bayan de Lakamon. Now maybe you're going to ask, let us say that this shows that he holds that Simonim are de Rabbanan, and then we can answer the question later on, meaning the fact that he is saying that the person has to say there's a hole at the side of this particular letter, doesn't that illustrate, not that Rav Ashi is in doubt whether Simonim are Doraisa or Rabbanan, that seems to actually indicate that Rav Ashi holds that Simonim are Rabbanan, that's why he requires a Simon Muvak over here. So to that Rashi says, La Pirchi, that's not a question. The Minolan the Pshitale, because still, how do we know that Rav Ashi knows for certain Simonim Rabbanan? Inami Mesafkali, even if he had a doubt whether Simonim are Rabbanan Doraisa, Isa Lela Mesa Misveka, still he should be strict because of the doubt, and so that's why the Gemara is saying Rav Ashi is Mesafkali. We don't know for sure what Rav Ashi holds. It could be Rav Ashi holds that Simonim are Rabbanan, but likewise it could be that Rav Ashi is in doubt. And the Gemara continues, Rava Bar Bar Chana, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Tes Amud Aleph.